Today I'd like to talk to you about VAT tax point dates, what they are, why they're important, and a few examples of what the tax point date would be in different circumstances. So the reason they're important is because the tax point date tells you the date at which a transaction must be accounted for VAT purposes. So that tells you if you're making a sale, which VAT return that sale needs to be on. If you are thinking about registering for VAT, it tells you whether that sale needs to be brought into the calculations. And if you're looking at recovering VAT, it tells you what VAT return it needs to go on. It's also important because if there's a change in the VAT rate or a change in the law, something like that, the tax point date tells you which piece of law, which bit of legislation, which rate applies to a particular transaction. So we start off every time with the basic tax point. And the basic tax point for the sale of goods is the date those goods are removed from the seller to the buyer, or if they're not moved, the date that they're made available to the buyer. So for example, if I go into a shop and I pick up a kettle off the shelf and go to the till and buy it, that date, the date that happens, is the basic tax point date. If instead of going into a shop, I order the kettle online, then the date that they dispatch it from the warehouse or the factory to me will be the tax point date. But there are some circumstances in which the basic tax point date is overwritten. If an invoice is raised within 14 days of the basic tax point taking place, that later invoice date becomes the actual tax point. Or if a payment or an invoice is raised earlier than the basic tax point date, the earlier date becomes the tax point. So, for example, if I've decided I want some new mugs made for my office with my logo on, and I order them on the 1st of May, they're dispatched on the 21st of May, and I get an invoice on the 31st of May, that invoice date becomes the tax point because it's within 14 days of the basic tax point. Alternatively, if I order them and the supplier says, well, you have to pay up front before I incur the costs printing all those for you getting them ready, then the date at the beginning when I make the payment is the actual tax point date. And it may be, if you've got deposits and things like that, that you'll have more than one tax point date. So using the same mug example, if they say they want a payment up front, the date I make the order, of £100, the date that I make that payment with the order is the tax point date when VAT must be declared on that initial £100. And if they then invoice the balance, say £400, on the 31st of May, after the mugs have been dispatched, that becomes the tax point date for the balance. So you may well have two different tax point dates for the same supply. So you just need to be careful and watch that. With services rather than goods, it can be slightly more complex because a service isn't something physical that you pick up and you can see when it's moved. So for services, the basic tax point is when the service is complete. So if you get someone in to plaster your walls, the date they finish that plastering, that's the basic tax point. And the overriding rules for the later invoice or the earlier invoice or payment will also apply in the same way as they did for goods. But for some services, of course, they're never actually finished. If you provide consultancy services and it's an ongoing basis, you have the same client for years and years, or if you rent a property, for example, this office that I rent, that I'm in now, you are being provided that property on an ongoing basis. So in those circumstances, for a continuous supply of services, the tax point date will be when an invoice is raised or when payment's made. So I pay my rent by direct debit on the first day of every month. That's going to be the tax point for those supplies. So it's just something to think about, something to look at. And there's been a couple of areas recently where tax point is, because everyone thinks, oh, well, it doesn't matter as long as it gets put on a VAT return. What does it really matter? But if you think about the reduced rate we've got because of COVID in the hospitality industry at the moment, that could make a massive difference, because we have a temporary reduced rate of 5% now, which started in July last year. From the 1st of October, that rate is going up to 12.5%. And then from the 1st of April 2022, as things stand at the moment, that rate will be going back up to 20%. So it's vitally important that you know when the tax point date is, so you know which of those 3 different rates to charge. And as a planning point, it's perfectly possible for a hotel to take bookings now and accept payments now for stays that take place next summer after the rate's gone back up to 20%, and the rate of VAT that will apply is the rate now, because the actual tax point will be the date the payment is taken, which is when the 5% rate applies. So it's certainly worth looking at. And interestingly, when there's a change in VAT rate, HMRC sometimes apply anti-forestalling legislation, which is to stop people playing about with the timing of supplies and bringing supplies forward to benefit from a lower rate. But it's specifically been said this time, because the intention of that temporary reduced rate is to help the businesses who have been most severely impacted by the COVID restrictions, there's no plans for any anti-forestalling legislation. So you can quite happily, with no issues, with the blessing of HMRC and the government, take bookings now with 5% VAT for stays July 2022, and that's not a problem at all. So I've also written a blog which goes into tax point dates in a bit more detail. If anybody wants to read that, I shall put the link in the comments so that you can find it. But if you've got any questions, if you've got any transactions where you've got payments in tranches, or if you've got any where you think you might be affected by a change in rate or a change in legislation, please do give me a call and I'd be happy to help. Thank you very much.